There comes a moment in every toxic dynamic when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. A moment when the person who has been giving, supporting, and carrying the emotional weight finally steps back and sees the situation for what it really is. This speech begins at that moment, a moment the narcissist never believed would arrive, because for so long they operated under the assumption that you would stay, no matter the disrespect, the manipulation, or the betrayal. They believed their charm, their control, and their ability to twist reality would always keep you within reach. But here's the part they never prepared for. The day you wake up, reclaim your clarity, and recognize the cost of keeping someone in your life who only takes. The day you stop rationalizing their behavior and start acknowledging your own worth. That moment marks the beginning of their downfall. Not because you harmed them, but because you finally removed yourself from the space they were exploiting. They expected you to break. What they didn't expect was that their betrayal would become the very catalyst that frees you and exposes them. This is the story of how a narcissist, convinced of their invincibility, had no idea that betraying you would ultimately ruin their own life. Narcissists move through the world with a deep sense of entitlement, a belief that they are above consequences, accountability, or any form of repercussion for the harm they cause. When they betray someone, it is rarely an impulsive act. It is usually rooted in a mindset that sees other people as extensions, resources, or tools. They assume the person they betray will tolerate it, forgive them, or stay attached because that dynamic has benefited them in the past. This inflated sense of superiority blinds them to reality. They genuinely believe they can get away with anything because their entire psychological structure is built on maintaining control and avoiding responsibility. To them, betrayal is simply an inconvenience, a move on a chessboard, never something that could change the course of their life. Because they lack empathy and emotional insight, they cannot grasp the impact their actions have on others, nor can they imagine a scenario where someone finally walks away. Their arrogance creates a false shield. They assume that their charm, manipulation, or guilt tactics will always work. They expect that the person they hurt will be too invested, too loyal, or too emotionally worn down to leave for good. This distorted perception is why they underestimate the moment their betrayal becomes the turning point. The narcissist sees themselves as the one in control, and in that belief, they overlook the strength building quietly in the person they continue to mistreat. The narcissist's inability to imagine consequences comes from years of emotional shortcuts. They've learned to dodge accountability by shifting blame, rewriting reality, or portraying themselves as the victim. These patterns reinforce the idea that consequences don't apply to them. They think they can replace people easily, believing there will always be someone else willing to give them attention, validation, admiration, or compliance. But this mindset sets them up for a devastating outcome they never anticipate. When they betray someone who finally decides they've had enough, the narcissist is caught completely off guard. They never considered that the person they saw as dependent was actually capable of walking away and rebuilding their life without them. It is this blind spot that becomes the catalyst for their downfall. The narcissist's illusion of invincibility shatters the moment they realize they misjudged the resilience of the person they betrayed. They didn't expect to lose access to someone who provided emotional depth, support, stability, and genuine connection, qualities they cannot replicate or create on their own. Their belief that they were untouchable becomes the very flaw that exposes their vulnerability. Narcissists often rely on betrayal as a way to maintain control, dominance, or emotional leverage, but they rarely recognize that this very behavior is a ticking time bomb in their own lives. To them, betrayal is a strategy, a maneuver designed to destabilize the other person and keep them off balance. Whether it's lying, cheating, triangulating, or breaking trust, the narcissist uses betrayal to assert power. It creates confusion, insecurity, and emotional dependency in the target, which serves the narcissist's need for superiority. In their mind, betrayal is not a moral failing, but a tool, a way to stay one step ahead and prevent others from challenging their authority or seeing their vulnerabilities. This mindset distances them further from emotional reality because they view relationships not as mutual connections, but as systems they must control. However, the narcissist's biggest miscalculation is believing betrayal has no cost. They assume they can shatter trust and the other person will either tolerate it or return to them, simply because that has worked in the past. Their emotional blindness makes them underestimate how deeply betrayal can change someone. People eventually reach a point where the pain becomes clarity. Once that clarity arrives, the narcissist loses the control they depended on. What the narcissist sees as routine manipulation becomes the very moment the relationship begins to collapse. Betrayal may give them temporary power, but it slowly erodes the foundation that keeps people connected to them. When the betrayed person finally decides to detach, the narcissist experiences a form of collapse they are not equipped to handle. Their life begins to destabilize because the emotional supply they relied on is suddenly gone. What started as a tactic to maintain power ends up leaving them disoriented, unsupported, and deprived of the attention that kept their fragile ego intact. They never expect the person they betrayed to reclaim their strength, set boundaries, or walk away completely. In their mind, betrayal should reinforce loyalty through fear or confusion, not spark self-awareness and independence. This is where their strategy backfires. Betrayal also damages the narcissist's external world more than they understand. Their reputation suffers, trust dissolves, and new sources of supply become harder to maintain. People start to see patterns, recognizing the manipulation behind the charm. The narcissist, who once relied on betrayal as a shortcut, now finds themselves surrounded by instability of their own making. Their life begins to unravel not because someone punished them, but because they underestimated the impact of their own actions. The very tool they use to feel powerful becomes the reason they lose control over the relationships and attention they depend on. Narcissists often convince themselves that people are interchangeable, disposable, and easily replaced. But this belief is rooted in denial rather than reality. When they betray and ultimately lose someone who is empathic, grounded, emotionally intelligent, and genuinely caring, the impact is far deeper than they expected. They do not realize that people with emotional depth bring qualities into a narcissist's life that the narcissist cannot create on their own. These qualities, stability, compassion, understanding, patience, and genuine connection, become the emotional scaffolding that holds up the narcissist's fragile inner world. Even if the narcissist never acknowledges it out loud, they rely heavily on the presence of such a person. The narcissist thrives on the validation and emotional regulation provided by someone who understands feelings, communicates with maturity, and offers support without expecting manipulation in return. They exploit these traits, assuming such kindness is endless. Their entitlement leads them to believe that this kind of person will always be available, no matter how much harm or disrespect they inflict. They take empathy for weakness, compassion for dependency, and loyalty for blind devotion. This distorted interpretation blinds them to the truth. Losing such a person is not just an inconvenience, it is a rupture that destabilizes their emotional ecosystem. When the empathic, grounded person finally walks away, the narcissist experiences a void they cannot explain to themselves. It feels like a drop in their internal equilibrium. They don't necessarily miss the person in a healthy emotional way, but they certainly miss the benefits. They miss the steady reassurance, the emotional labor, the calming presence, and the sense of identity they borrowed from that connection. These are elements they cannot replicate through new supply because superficial attention lacks the emotional substance that once held them together. This loss reminds them, though they may never admit it, that not all people are the same and not all connections can be replaced. The The narcissist may attempt to fill the gap immediately, seeking attention from anyone willing to provide it. But nothing lands the same way because new supply cannot offer the depth, consistency, or understanding they previously enjoyed. The narcissist begins to notice their irritability increasing, their emotional instability surfacing, and their sense of control slipping. Their life feels emptier, more chaotic, and more unpredictable. What they dismissed as an insignificant loss becomes a haunting reminder of the connection they misused and destroyed. In moments of quiet or crisis, the narcissist confronts the uncomfortable truth that they lost someone who made their world easier, softer, and more regulated. This realization is painful because it exposes a weakness they spend their entire lives trying to hide. Your absence becomes one of the most powerful and unexpected consequences a narcissist ever encounters because it exposes the inner emptiness they have spent their entire lives avoiding. Narcissists rely heavily on external validation, what is often called supply, to regulate their fragile sense of self. As long as they have someone available to praise them, soothe them, admire them, or react to them, they feel temporarily stabilized. They may never admit it, but the emotional presence of another person acts as a buffer between them and their own internal insecurity. When you were in their life, your empathy, your emotional sensitivity, and your consistency served as a form of regulation for them. You helped calm their chaos. You helped anchor their identity. You helped soften their anxiety. They took it all for granted, assuming they could access it whenever they wanted. When you finally pull away, detach, or go no contact, the narcissist loses that emotional grounding. At first, they may react with anger, denial, or arrogance, trying to convince themselves that your absence means nothing. But underneath that facade is panic. Without you, they are forced to face feelings they do not have the skills to process. Insecurity rises to the surface, and the emptiness inside them becomes louder. Narcissists are emotionally underdeveloped, which means they cannot comfort themselves or regulate their own distress in healthy ways. They rely on others to do it for them. Your absence removes that emotional crutch. As the days and weeks pass, the narcissist begins to feel the withdrawal from the supply you once provided. They may attempt to fill the void with distractions, new relationships, drama, constant stimulation, or attention-seeking behaviors, but none of it truly replaces what they lost. The depth and stability you offered cannot be replicated by superficial sources. Every new interaction feels hollow. Every new person becomes a temporary fix, and the narcissist becomes increasingly restless. This restlessness is actually their internal world collapsing in slow motion. They start to encounter the reality that they are alone with their own inadequacy. Your absence also forces them to confront the consequences of their addiction to supply. Narcissists use people like emotional fuel, never thinking about what happens when the tank runs dry. Now, without access to you, they see how dependent they were. This is a crushing experience for someone who prides themselves on independence, superiority, and control. They start to realize they were never in control at all. They were simply leaning on someone who cared enough to hold things together. Most importantly, your absence highlights the fact that they cannot create the things they lost: empathy, warmth, emotional safety, genuine connection. They must now face the truth that these qualities only entered their life through other people. When those people walk away, the narcissist is left in an emotional desert they do not know how to navigate. A narcissist's entire identity is built on a fragile foundation of image, perception, and the illusion of control, so when their betrayal finally catches up to them, what collapses is much bigger than just a relationship. It affects the structure of their entire life. Narcissists survive through carefully crafted narratives, stories about who they are, how others see them, and how much influence they believe they have. These narratives depend on people believing in them, admiring them, or at least tolerating their behavior. When someone they depended on walks away, especially someone who offered stability and emotional grounding, the narcissist's image begins to crumble from the inside out. What they never predicted is how much that single loss would shake the foundation they spent years building. Their collapse often starts with the breakdown of their public persona. Narcissists rely heavily on being perceived as charming, successful, charismatic, or morally superior. But betrayal has a way of revealing patterns. When you step back and no longer protect their reputation or excuse their behavior, people around them begin to see inconsistencies. Their facade becomes harder to maintain because the emotional labor you once provided, calming situations, smoothing conflicts, explaining their behavior, is no longer there. Without someone to manage the social and emotional fallout, their image naturally begins to unravel. Then comes the collapse of their influence. Narcissists rely on having people around them who are willing to invest emotionally, give attention, or provide validation. But as their reputation weakens and as their behavior becomes more visible, the people they turn to for support start to distance themselves. Others pick up on the emotional chaos, the manipulation, the self-centeredness, and they start to question the narcissist's intentions. What used to be admiration slowly turns into caution or avoidance. The narcissist begins to lose control over social dynamics, family relationships, work environments, or friend circles. Influence that once came easily now becomes harder to maintain. At the same time, their supply sources begin to fail. The loss of someone who provided deep, consistent support highlights how shallow their other connections truly are. New supply doesn't offer the emotional depth they need. The narcissist may try to replace you quickly, but every new person feels empty, temporary, and inadequate. This creates emotional instability that they cannot regulate. It leads to frustration, panic, irritability, and impulsive decisions that make their life even more chaotic. What started as a small crack in their sense of power becomes a widening fracture. Ultimately, their collapse stems from one truth they never anticipated. The person they betrayed was holding up far more of their emotional and psychological world than they realized. Losing that person triggers a chain reaction that exposes everything they've tried to hide: the insecurity, the loneliness, the facade, and the dependency they swore they didn't have. Your healing and growth become the final blow a narcissist never saw coming because it represents the one outcome they believe is impossible: you rising beyond their influence. Narcissists depend on the idea that you will stay wounded, confused, or emotionally attached long after the relationship ends. They expect that their betrayal will leave you stuck in rumination, self-doubt, or a cycle of trying to understand what went wrong. They assume the damage they caused will weaken you permanently. But when you begin to heal, truly heal, it disrupts the entire power structure they spent so long building. Healing means you are no longer available to be manipulated, guilted, or pulled back into their orbit, and for a narcissist, that is a devastating loss. Your growth changes the dynamic even more dramatically. As you rebuild your sense of self, strengthen your boundaries, and reclaim your emotional clarity, the narcissist's old tactics stop working. You stop reacting to their provocations. You stop giving them attention. You stop believing their narratives. You no longer internalize their criticisms or fall for their sudden kindness. This emotional detachment is something a narcissist cannot handle because it removes the control they counted on. They were certain you would always respond to them in predictable ways, but your growth makes you unpredictable to them. That unpredictability feels like losing their grip on a source of power they once took for granted. Your healing also exposes their limitations. As you move toward healthier relationships, self-awareness, and emotional freedom, it highlights the narcissist's stagnation. They stay the same while you evolve. They repeat the same patterns while you break yours. They remain emotionally underdeveloped while you gain insight and resilience. This contrast can feel humiliating to them, even if they never express it. They see that you are thriving without them, and that realization forces them to confront the uncomfortable truth that their presence in your life was a burden, not a benefit. Your progress becomes a mirror that reflects their dysfunction back to them. Healing also cuts off their access. When you are emotionally steady and self-confident, you become immune to the very tactics that once gave them power. Love bombing doesn't work. Guilt doesn't work. Triangulation doesn't work. Their attempts to reinsert themselves fall flat, and each failed attempt chips away at their ego. They begin to understand that you are no longer someone they can use, influence, or draw energy from. This loss of access is catastrophic because they relied on you more than they ever admitted. Ultimately, your growth becomes the revenge you never had to plan. By reclaiming your peace, rebuilding your identity, and refusing to return to the chaos, you deliver the one outcome narcissists cannot tolerate, you proving that life is better without them. In the end, the very thing the narcissist believed would keep them powerful, their manipulation, their betrayal, their sense of superiority, becomes the force that unravels their world. They never imagined that their actions would push you toward clarity, strength, and self-preservation. They never anticipated that by taking you for granted, they would lose access to the stability and emotional grounding you brought into their life. What they assumed was weakness in you became the foundation of your transformation. And what they assumed was strength in themselves was revealed to be nothing more than a fragile facade. Your departure, your healing, and your refusal to return to the dysfunction exposed the truth they spend their lives avoiding. Their control was an illusion. They depended on your empathy, your steadiness, and your willingness to carry more than your share of the emotional weight. Without that, their image cracks, their supply weakens, and their inner emptiness becomes impossible to ignore. The life they tried to build on manipulation and domination begins to collapse, not because you sought revenge, but because they underestimated the cost of their own behavior. The betrayal that was meant to break you ends up breaking the illusion they had of themselves. And while they are left wrestling with the chaos they created, you rise into a clearer, stronger version of yourself, one grounded in boundaries, self-respect, and emotional truth. Their downfall is not your victory, your healing is. The greatest consequence they face is seeing you thrive in a life they no longer have access to, a life where their presence is no longer required to define your worth.